All right, continuing our talk on Buddhism. In our last video, we talked about the historical figure Siddhartha Gautama, who later became known as the Buddha. We talked about how Buddhism is a term, an honorific term, which means enlightened one. And today I wanted to talk about what happened after his death and some of the transmission and kind of sort of like the metamorphosis that Buddhism went through. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a very synchronistic religion. In other words, when it comes into another culture, even though they may appear very divergent, Buddhism comes in and tries to align with the existing religions of the area. You saw a very similar thing in Christianity as it spread out from the Mediterranean world and entered into Arabic-speaking countries, into Germanic-speaking countries, into the Celtic countries. And in each case, there was bringing the original message of the gospel, but as it entered into different cultural regions, it took on accretions, almost like barnacles to a boat that adapted or had it move in to these other countries. And Buddhism was very much the same thing. So I want to start, this is just going to be very broad strokes. I would love to do a whole class on Buddhism, but I just want to give you a broad historical picture. So after Siddhartha Gautama passed, his teachings, because of his disciples, continued after him. And these teachings, as they spread throughout the subcontinent of India, eventually found a powerful patron in the warlord called Ashoka, later known as Ashoka the Great. And Ashoka was coming out of the Hindu tradition, just like Siddhartha Gautama did. And unlike Siddhartha Gautama, he went for the path of power and lordship over that of savior or reconciler. But after he had subdued all the other kingdoms on the subcontinent of India, Ashoka converted from Hinduism to Buddhism. And we already talked how Buddhism is much more pacifistic religion. In Hinduism, it might be your dharma to be a king or a warrior or someone that it is your duty in this life to defend your family, your country, your religion. But in Buddhism, there is a much more sense of really connecting to that oneness that we all share, regardless of caste, ethnicity, gender. All these sorts of things are merged into the concept of the one. And also different is this kind of disassociation from the caste system for the Buddhists, because they realized if we were all part of the one, then it doesn't matter if you're a Brahmin or an untouchable or a dog or a cat or an ant. We're all connected to this concept of the one. And anyone can get off this wheel of samsara, this wheel of illusion, at any time. I also mentioned to you that part of what I liked about Buddhism over Hinduism was the concept of a bodhisattva. And a bodhisattva is one who has reached enlightenment, but they have decided to remain and to help other sentient beings reach enlightenment as well. And I gave a shout out to the 14th Dalai Lama because he is one of these bodhisattvas who his devotees and himself believes he has come back 14 times.
What's the alternative to remaining?
Oh, you can simply will yourself off the wheel of illusion and return to the one. And it's a figure of speech because no one ever leaves the one, but you are consciously reunited with that oneness. But in doing so, you lose your individualness. And so it comes at quite a price in that sense. You have to lose yourself to find the one. Okay. Now, it is interesting because we are looking at some of the parallels in this kind of comparative religion class between this idea. In Christianity, we have this idea of death to the self, right? Or being crucified with Christ. Well, in Buddhism, they call it annihilation of the self. And the self they're talking about is the ego. But the tricky part in Buddhism is annihilation of the self has to be done by the self. And that's quite a paradox, right? Because even if you succeed in killing yourself, who gets the credit for self-destruction? Well, it's like, is there another self in there? What's going on? Who's doing the killing? And in Christianity, the death of self happens to us by another. It talks about we are crucified with Christ, and no one can crucify themselves. It has to be done by another, because the best you could hope for is to get your feet nailed down and one of your hands, but you'd still have one hand waving free. So I'd call that almost crucified or 3/4 crucified, but you can't crucify yourself. It has to be done by another. Whereas in Buddhism, this is something you're doing either through no mind meditation, working through different koans. There's lots of different techniques to aim at the annihilation of the self. And what we're talking about there is that ego self, that identifying yourself as unique or separate from everything else. That is what you're trying to deconstruct. And in doing so, you become open to everything, a connection with everything. All right, well, back to Ashoka the Great. After Ashoka conquers the subcontinent, he converts to Buddhism and pretty much makes everyone else convert to Buddhism too, which I'm not trying to be too jaded or cynical, but Buddhism being more pacifistic, it was quite a brilliant move. So do your warring as a Hindu and then convert to Buddhism to rule, and to encourage everyone to be in this peaceful, collective, cooperative state. Well, unfortunately for Buddhism in India, this did not last very long, because as more and more people began to practice Buddhism and to detach from this physical material world, which is illusion, it created economic and social problems, as you can imagine. If people are realizing that being a farmer is pure illusion and that you are part of the one, well, why should you waste your time going out and planting the rice fields, right? Or milking the cows or these other things? Because being here in this physical frame, in this physical world, it's all transitory. Why should we put our time, devotion, effort into these things which will pass away? A very similar thing happened in Christianity in the Middle Ages. When most of Europe had converted, a lot of people had this otherworldly attitude, like this life is like a pre-purgatory purgatory, and we're put here for the trying of our souls, and this life is pain and suffering, just like in Buddhism. And the idea is we're just trying to endure it to get to the other shore, that gate, gate, paragate, parasangate. But in a Christian idea, that this world is pain and suffering, and we're just trying to get by until we get to see Jesus, and then it's just like pure pleasure, eternal banquets, you know, just all our wants and desires satisfied. Well, in Buddhism, well, and that's what led to the Dark Ages in medieval Europe, where people stopped developing technology, medicines, architecture, philosophy, because why? Why put your efforts in all these transitory passing things? Why not spend your time meditating and focusing on your oneness? Well, as this happened in India, there was kind of like a backlash against Buddhism. It's like people became so Buddhally minded that they were no earthly good. And so there was a deconversion back into Hinduism, and we see that today. India in the subcontinent, I believe, is over 95%, maybe even higher. People identify with some version of Hinduism. I think Buddhism maybe only accounts for less than 2% of the population of the place where Buddhism had its birth, and at one time dominated the subcontinent. But by as early as 250 AD, there were Buddhist missionaries going out. So this is about 250 years after the historic Siddhartha Gautama. We had Buddhist missionaries going to Southeast Asia, through Indonesia. They went north over the Himalayas into China. from China, they spread to Korea, then to Japan, and then eventually Buddhism, specifically after World War II, made its way to the Americas, especially California. And we'll talk about that at the end. But as Buddhism spread, these different Buddhist missionaries, they adapted or syncretized to the countries in which they went. So when Buddhism went to China, China is already a very ancient civilization. But when Bodhidharma, he was called the hairy barbarian from the north, and he was like this Buddhist missionary that brought the teachings of the Buddha into China. But in China were already two very ancient philosophies, and this was Taoism and Confucianism. And both Lao Tzu, who is credited with writing the Tao Te Ching, and Kung Fu Sei, who the transliteration in English is Confucius, were both contemporaries of Siddhartha Gautama. So their philosophies, or if you want to call them religions, go back as far as Buddhism. And so here you have Bodhidharma coming in from the north, and he's bringing the teachings of the Buddha, which are coming out of that Hindu pantheistic tradition, but with this idea of enlightenment is available to every human this time around. You do not have to reincarnate again if you do not want to, if you're able to get rid of desire. But if you desire even one more breath on your deathbed, you will get a whole lifetime of more breaths. So it has to be a total lack of desire, even that of continuing to live or to breathe, if you can imagine what that would take to get there. When Bodhidharma comes into northern China and interacts with Taoism and Confucianism, there was like a competition between these three versions of life. And there's a famous Chinese scroll or painting, and it's called the Three Vinegar Tasters. And in this, it's like an allegorical painting. And the three characters is the Buddha, or like Bodhidharma, Lao Tzu, and Kung Fu Sei. And they're all dipping their finger into a jar of vinegar and tasting it. And the Buddhist, he tastes it and it's bitter, right? That sour, bitter taste, like the suffering we have in life. And for the Confucianist, they're more analytical, and they're more thinking about manners and etiquette and how to interact in society. But for the Taoists, the followers of the way, they are simply taking the vinegar for what it is, for its good uses and its negative uses, right? You can use it as an insecticide or to add savoriness to your rice dish or whatever. And so you have the Taoists just kind of like being, you have the Confucianist with this analytical judgment, and you have the the Buddhist just trying to disassociate from any pain or suffering in life. The Confucianists are trying to manage it by being polite and have etiquette in society, like the domestic way of living, how to live in society with others, while the Taoists are more like looking at the way of nature, how to just go with the flow, how to go around obstacles. And so when we have Buddhism combined with Taoism and Confucianism, we get this hybrid that's called Chan Buddhism. And this became a powerful influence that then later sent out missionaries to Korea and then later to Japan. When Chan Buddhism came to Korea, it was a very animistic, shamanistic society. Lots of witchcraft, lots of spells, incantations. And so Buddhism comes in and it hybridizes with that system. And so now you have the Buddhist teachings, but you still have a lot of the leftover superstition, manipulation of spirits. And so people would actually use Buddhist symbols and talismans as like wards against evil. They would chant the sutras almost like incantations against magic. They believed in lots of supernatural healing, miracles, those sorts of things. As Chan Buddhist missionaries then went from Korea to Japan, they encountered Shinto, and Shinto is like ancestor worship. If you saw the the movie or read the book Mulan, even though it takes place in China, the cultures were very similar in this regard. We talked about this in like the Day of the Dead cultures around the world. And they were also a very animistic culture. Japan, they believed they were the islands of the gods. Even the emperor was believed to be divine. And there was a tremendous reverence for those that had died. And just like in Mulan, your dead relatives, they were disconnected from their body, but they were not disconnected from you, and they could still influence your life for good or ill. They could look over you like benevolent spirits. They could intercede to you to the deities above, or they could make your life more difficult and thwart you if you were disparaging the family name or not following the way you were brought up. So your dead relatives are still very much involved in your life. It's not like they die and then they no longer have contact. And so when Chan Buddhism comes and interacts, oh, and also huge animistic culture in Japan. Some of you are into anime, you know, the cartoons and things like that. But if you pay attention, it's usually very spiritually involved. One of my favorite anime artists is Miyazaki, and he did things like Princess Mononoke. It's kind of like the spirits of the forest against the spirits of industrialization or development. They're Spirited Away. That's a great one. It's like a bathhouse for the spirits, where the spirits come in and get refreshed and then go back out to do their jobs. And there's witches and demons and dragons and all that stuff in that one. And then, I don't know, this may be my personal favorite. It's called My Neighbor Totoro. And it's about the spirits of the forest and how they interact with these small children and help them grow things in their garden. And My Neighbor Totoro. And all of those would be really appropriate if you choose to do them for your application project. And for the application project, it's fairly simple. I'm just looking for 10 examples of the world view that is in the book or the movie or song or whatever you're using. And then there's 3 critique questions, like, was it blatant or subtle? Was it harmful or harmless? And would you let a child under your care watch it? And if so, would there be like qualifiers? So it's a very simple project, but it gets you to see that these things we're talking about are happening in our culture today. It's not just thousands of years ago, but it's happening right now in Saturday morning cartoons, in children's literature, in pop culture. And no, I have not seen Bleach, Josiah. I don't know. All right, so when Chan joins Shintoism, we get a new hybrid, which is my personal favorite type of Buddhism. And this is called Zen Buddhism. And many people claim Zen could be a principle separate from Buddhism, but because of the cultural context and the religions and philosophies, we end up getting Zen Buddhism. But Zen is an approach to life. It's like a direct seeing. It's like becoming like a little child again. It's trying to deconstruct that matrix we have in our minds. And we use that as a template to interact with the world. But what the Buddhists are saying is, no, what you're doing is you're bringing an artificial human construct to the world instead of seeing the world as it is. So part of the Zen Buddhist meditation is to empty the mind, this no mind meditation, where you simply quiet the thoughts within, and you become like an observer of your thoughts. So when you're doing this no mind meditation, and you could start simple, like just set a timer for like 5 minutes, sit in a, not have any distractions, and you simply sit. Your eyes can be open or closed, it doesn't matter, but you're simply trying to sit, and you become aware of your thoughts, but you don't engage them. And what's going to happen is you'll notice you have this voice constantly going inside your head. I like to call it the internal dialogue. And it's, I think, how we stay connected to this world of illusion, to this physical, material, transitory world. We keep bouncing words off the world to like anchor us to it. And what this no mind meditation is doing is it's getting rid of those anchors, and you simply become an observer, and the world will begin to shift on you. In a Christian concept, I would say it's like becoming like a little child again. You're not having all these critiques, judgments, evaluations. You're simply observing, full of wonder and excitement about this world that is unfolding before you. Part of what can happen during this meditation, and this could be a formal like Zen session where you're sitting in a Dharma hall in a lotus position and you're staring at a wall, sitting on your little cushion, and you could be meditating like this up to 8 hours a day and just trying to still these thoughts in your mind, watching them, your thoughts like fish going in a stream, but you're not trying to catch them or engage with them. You're just observing. You become an observer of your thoughts. And this is what's so interesting to me, because that begs the question from my Western mind of who is that observer observing your thoughts? And the point is, you're trying to get into this like universal type of mind, away from your own individual petty ego into this kind of like universal perspective, the universum I. It's no longer about you, your wants, your needs, your hopes, your dreams, your fears, but you have let that go as you shed the ego, as you shed that individual self, and you now kind of back up and you become an observer of all the little things that happen in the world. But all those little things are just like a vapor. They're just like dust and ashes. They will not last. And so it's not where we should put our focus and attention. In the chapel talk I gave, I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago on meditation, I made a distinction between active and passive meditation. So that Zazen, Buddhist hall, no mind, that would be passive meditation. Or like a lot of the yoga, even though you're putting your body into contorted asanas and different shapes and stretches, it's still you're like in a specific place. You're not out doing things. But there's also active meditation. And for those of you that saw like Mr. Miyagi and the Karate Kid, those were like variations of Zen Buddhist type themes. And the idea was you can meditate just as well painting a fence, raking the yard, washing the dishes, changing poopy diapers as you could sitting cross-legged staring at the end of your nose. And think of all the stuff you can get done in the world of illusion while you are opening your mind to this universal I, this universum I. And you see the famous scenes of like Mr. Miyagi's young apprentice is like painting the fence, or he's waxing the car, or he's raking in the yard. And all of these can be means or mechanisms to get you to this place of enlightenment. And there's a fun term that's used, and it's called satori. And satori means like direct. It's just like a lightning bolt out of the heavens. It's like a direct enlightenment. And you just have one of those little aha moments. But that could happen seeing a baby smile, watching dust particles through the light beams in a room, seeing a sunset, watching a leaf fall from a tree, seeing a sprig of grass sprout up between the cracks in the asphalt or concrete. And you may just have a moment where everything is right with the world. You see your place in it. You see everything is just as it should be. And that is called satori. If we take our journey to the south, and we'll come back and talk about Zen later. I want to maybe spend some time reading some Zen koans. And those, part of Zen Buddhists, what they believe is that even though reason can be profitable in space-time in our interactions with others, when it comes to enlightenment, it just feeds the ego. Our reason is always there trying to defend and preserve the self, the ego, and its desires. And the misuse of reason, of course, is what I would call rationalization. But reason, instead of being an aid to enlightenment, like we have in Hinduism, where that is the highest path of enlightenment is through knowledge, in Zen Buddhists, they believe no, reason actually feeds in to making you separate from the one. Your reason will give you all kinds of reasons why you are unique, why you are an individual, why you are not the cosmos. And so part of the Zen Buddhist practice is to find ways to stun or negate the reason. And so they developed a series of koans, and a koan is like a short, pithy saying or question. And the point of it is to try to get you to transcend that rational mind into something even higher, something that can connect you to the one. The first koan I ever heard, and you've probably all heard this one, was, what is the sound of one hand clapping? There is no logical answer to that. And so what the abbot or the sensei who is asking that question is trying to understand from you is, do you grasp the deeper teaching? Do you understand the truth beyond the question? And a lot of people will get so caught up in the question, right? And trying to all these different things, like, how can I make one hand? But that's not what's being sought at here. This isn't a physiological question. It's trying to point you beyond. So typically what it would happen when you come in, if any of you saw Fight Club, I'm sure you didn't, my good Christian students, but if you did, their house that they all lived in, that kind of flop house, it was kind of set up like a Zen Buddhist monastery. And in order to join, new petitioners would have to come and ask to become a part of the group. But they would be disabused, they would be left out in all elements. And part of it was to see, are you really serious? Do you really understand the rigors involved in what is being asked here in this house of meditation? And sometimes people would be left for days, if not weeks, on the front doorstep to see if they were really interested and had a resolve to study. And once they were admitted, they would be kind of evaluated by the abbot to see where they spiritually were, where their understanding was, and they would be given appropriate koans to then meditate and think on. A good friend of mine went and studied at Zen Mountain Center, and that's just up there by Idlewild in California. And it's something you could go to on, you could book like a weekend retreat, or they have week-long retreats, or you could just drive up for the day, and I'm sure one of the brothers or nuns would be happy to give you a little tour of the grounds. It's quite lovely. And his first koan that he received was, where does wind come from? And then his abbot asked him to go and meditate on that. And when he felt he had an answer, he was to come back and presented it to him. And for some people, it might come to them immediately. For others, it might be 6 months, maybe years, where they are struggling and wrestling, trying to understand the idea. Now, on a side note, I told my friend, because of what little understanding I have of Zen Buddhism, I said, when you go back in for your evaluation and your abbot asks you where wind comes from, just slightly lift one leg and just rip the biggest fart you can muster, and then just go into a belly laugh. And I said, they'll make you like co-abbot of the monastery, just right then and there. But he wouldn't do it. He did run it by his abbot, and his abbot thought it was funny, but said that was not the answer. But see, there is no right or wrong answer. That's not the point. What the abbot's looking for is, from the depths of your being, can you express where this is coming from? My friend did successfully answer that question. I won't tell you his response, but his next question was where water came from. And you can imagine what I told him to on that occasion. But anyways, Zen Buddhism, it's meant to be very spontaneous, because what had happened in Buddhism, just like in Christianity, after centuries of development and formulas and rules and how people should dress, what they should eat, how they should cut their hair, it became just another dead legal system. And people would go into it and their spirits would be crushed. They were forced to conform into these like preset ideal molds of what a Buddhist should look like, be like, think like, act like, talk like. And Zen Buddhism was meant to break that and to return to that spontaneity, just that immediate enlightenment coming through our everyday life. And that's what I love about Zen Buddhism, is this idea that we can just go about our daily lives, either, you know, having homes, having shops, being a gardener, being a tailor, being a teacher, but enlightenment can happen to us in that context. And we just need to be in this open and ready place. It doesn't mean you can't practice discipline and self-control and meditation, but you're not trying to force something. And because remember, you're just trying to realize who you already are. You're not trying to become something you're not. So you're not having to do all these things or learn all these things. It's more of a realization of what already is. And so you could come about that by being a fisherman or a surfer or a musician. You don't have to go sit in a monastery in the Buddha hall and do chants or meditations or prayers. And so I really like that aspect of Zen Buddhism. I got about 10 minutes left, and so let's just head to the south a little for contrast. So whereas the northern missionaries encountered Taoism and Confucianism, when Buddhism went to the south, it encountered either Hinduism or another type of animism, you know, coming from Southeast Asia. And I think it is interesting. We had talked about the different types of Buddhas in the past one, and that big, chubby, happy going Buddha, that was like the Chinese version of the Buddha. But as you head to Southeast Asia, it usually gets a lot more severe, more like in his ascetic period, where he was like skin and bones, living off of bird and rain droppings. And they kind of focus on that ascetic version. But then in other places, you'll see more of like a serene, a composed, like the Buddha in his enlightened state. So as we move through like the ancient kingdoms of like Burma or Thailand, modern day Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and then moving down into Malaysia, Singapore, and even Indonesia, as Buddhism spreads through those countries, it interacts and syncretizes with those beliefs. And so you have a lot more spiritism, a lot more animism involved, a lot like the Korean Buddhism to the north. In broad strokes, however, I would say that northern path, that Mahayana, is a lot more like Protestantism in that there's a lot of diversity. Everyone's just kind of like picking their own path, their own way, what works for them, maybe being a little eclectic, taking bits and pieces, and then kind of like customizing their own path. Whereas the southeastern type of Buddhism that went through Southeast Asia, it's much more rigid, formal, like prescribed color of robes, prescribed haircuts, prescribed diet, prescribed pilgrimages, prescribed fasts, prescribed prayers. So to me, it's much more like loosely saying, like the Roman Catholic tradition. It's much more formal. They have formal like monasteries. You don't see a lot of Protestant monasteries and things of that nature. And the idea is kind of like the imitation principle. So like in the Middle Ages, we have Thomas A. Kempis writing The Imitation of Christ for Christians, with this idea like if we could just imitate Christ, we could become like him. And the same concept was in Buddhism. If we could simply imitate the dress, the diet, the routine, the meditation of Siddhartha Gautama, then we too have a good chance of reaching enlightenment. Eventually, Buddhism does come to the United States and Europe, and once again, it syncretizes. we have some of the most vibrant Buddhist communities in the world here in California. And I think part of that is because most of the people that came here they're either immigrants from Asia or they are first generation Buddhists. They have people who have converted into Buddhism from other traditions, either Christianity or atheism or some Western philosophy or religion. And so it's new and fresh to them and they're all in. And there's a really good site called buddhanet.net, and it has a web link where you can look at all the Buddhist monasteries and temples and churches, I believe, in the world, at least the ones that are registered. And I think you'll be quite stunned how many we have just here in San Diego County alone. So if you need a place to do a visit, I don't know if any of these temples are doing virtual visits during the COVID, but there's a lot of options, at least people you could call and do interviews with or those things if you want to increase your understanding. All right, well, that's all for this lecture today, and I'm going to leave my class with a few chant videos, which I can post up later.